And good evening to those of you in Europe, and good morning to those of you in Australia. Welcome to the opening plenary session of the ESIG 2021 Spring Technical Workshop. We had a great kickoff with a keynote session on Tuesday with Chris Clack discussing clean energy scenarios for 2050, and another great session lined up for today. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG, and I will provide a few brief opening remarks. As you know, our spring workshop sessions are all being held online and are open to everyone. The workshop was planned with the input of our ESIG Offerings Committee, chaired by Bethany Frew of NREL and Julia Matoivasan of ERCOT. The committee consists of the chairs of our 6 working groups and several of our board members. We have a great set of volunteers who really make ESIG what it is, and we encourage you to become involved if you're not already. Regarding logistics, I would ask you to note that the webinar will be an hour and a half long. We had a lot of feedback that our 1-hour workshop sessions were too rushed. So our revised format today will have individual presentations of approximately 15 to 20 minutes each in the first hour. And we plan to hold the questions for a 30-minute Q&A session after the last speaker. As we are doing with all of our webinars now, we'll be using the Slido platform for managing the Q&A, not the WebEx platform. You should go to slido.com on your device and enter ESIG4 as the event code to ask your questions. Please be sure to indicate the person to whom you're addressing the question. The instructions are also in the background slide for the webinar, and you'll be reminded by the session chair. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the question on Slido to allow you to vote on prioritizing the questions submitted. So please keep the questions coming during the presentations, and we will address them at the end. Recognizing the limitations of a webinar with more than 100 people on the line will be muted. So again, we ask you to use the Slido platform to ask your questions with ESIG4 as the event code. The opening plenary today deals with the topic of electricity pricing, which is a pretty hot topic these days. Looking at a future where most of our generation could be coming from zero marginal cost renewable energy makes this a critically important topic in the market design world as well. The session will be chaired by Debbie Liu, who serves as the Associate Director of ESIG and is well known to many of you. Debbie joined ESIG at the end of last year. She's a very welcome addition to the staff, and we're very fortunate to have her. Debbie, we appreciate having you chair this session, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Charlie. So welcome everyone to the session on electricity pricing. This is my favorite topic. I'm really excited about this, and we have a great lineup of speakers today. Many of us at ESIG haven't traditionally focused on rate design or retail price signals that flow down to customers, but we all know we need to extract flexibility from demand, right? We need it for resource adequacy, to mitigate against loss of load events. We know we need it for balancing, right? So to fill in the belly of the duck curve and meet peak, and we need it to manage electrification. And we know that the grid is always balancing supply against demand, but a lot of our focus with system operators and in planning is focused on the supply side. So we're missing half the equation. This is why I'm so excited about today's session, why I think flexible demand is the low-hanging fruit that we really need to exploit better. And we are going to, we can and we will build storage, we'll build transmission, maybe we'll build flexible nuclear reactors and a hydrogen economy like Chris Clack mentioned on Tuesday. But today we can eke out a lot of flexibility from demand with today's technology. And today's session is going to focus on how you do that with pricing. So as the grid evolves, the needs are going to evolve. We all know that. And pricing needs to evolve to meet those needs. For example, if you're planning on solar as a large part of your decarbonization strategy, you're probably also thinking about storage to help manage your duck curve. And time of use rates act like storage. And it should be something you're considering at the same time you're considering new investments in storage. And on the right here, this is a load duration curve in blue and a net load duration curve in orange. So net load duration curve, you take the hourly load, you subtract out the wind and the solar, and you do that for every hour of the year, and you rank that, and you get this net load duration curve. And when we have high penetrations of wind and solar, we know that this tends to make these net load duration curves peakier, meaning that you need a lot of megawatts to run for a few hours of the year. And traditionally, we used to think about, new gas peakers. Now we might think about storage for this, but it's a hard investment to justify for, these few hours of the year. And here, critical peak pricing or peak time rebates, like Steve Beuning will mention later, that acts like a gas peaker, and it could obviate the need for expensive generators that are rarely used. Whereas on the customer side, they like it if they're rarely called upon to reduce load. We lost our ERCOT speaker to the fallout from the recent Texas event. So I'm going to show a few slides under ERCOT to make up for that gap, because Texas has been able to achieve quite a lot with different kinds of price signals. And I'd like to try and disaggregate some of that and explain this to folks. After the presentations are done, we will talk about the Texas blackouts. But for now, I want to just talk about some of the successes that Texas has had with different kinds of pricing. So many of you already know ERCOT's got an energy-only market, $9,000 per megawatt hour price cap, an operating reserve demand curve that gives price adders to indicate when they're getting close to scarcity conditions. And you probably also know that for a long time, industrial loads have provided half of what I call contingency reserves. So they've always done some innovative things. In addition to that, Texas has a 4 coincident peak, or 4CP, demand charge tariff to allocate transmission charges. So how does this work? They determine the 15-minute peak interval in June, and then also in July, and then in August, and in September. And if you're subject to this tariff, your consumption during these 4 intervals determines essentially your transmission charge for the next year, based on how much you contributed to that peak load during those 4 intervals. What's important to note here is that about half of ERCOT load is subject to 4CP. So basically the large commercial and industrial customers, and then this NOIE is the munis and the co-ops. And the customers on these 4CP tariffs, they can directly reduce the charges on their bills for the following year by reducing usage during 4CP intervals, and munis and co-ops can reduce their share of the system transmission cost and pass that down to their customers. So the important thing there is in Texas, transmission charges have increased a lot over the last couple of decades. So, at the beginning of this graphic, 2002, it's something like $17 per 4CP kilowatt. And now it's $54. So, there's been a lot of transmission expansion. We had the CREZ projects that was, over $7 billion, including about $5 billion in 2013. Also another couple $1 billion in 2016. There's been a lot of load growth, and transmission had to be expanded for a lot of reasons. That transmission needs to get paid for. The savings that a customer can have by trying to reduce their usage during these 4CP periods can be really significant. So let's just take this example of a transmission connected customer in a center point territory. If they can reduce their load by 1 megawatt for each of the 4CP intervals, they could save $49,000 for the following year. Right? That's based on their transmission charge, their transmission cost recovery factor. So there's a significant potential savings here, and there's now a whole industry that's around predicting when 4CP is going to happen, and then helping customers plan demand response for those intervals. And of course, if everyone's chasing 4CP by proactively lowering their demand when peak would have otherwise occurred, you can imagine there's a large amount of voluntary demand reduction happening. So this shows that voluntary reduction due to 4CP for the last several years. And ERCOT does these analyses looking at which customers are exposed to 4CP and looking at some baselines. and estimating what that reduction is. So the y-axis here is megawatts reduction due to 4CP, chasing 4CP intervals. So that the green dots are the near 4CP days. So they might have been a 4CP day, except there was enough reduction that they weren't. And the blue squares are the actual 4CP days. And you can see there's up to 2,500 to 3,000 megawatts of reduction. So voluntary reduction to avoid these charges. And I want to, in particular, call your attention to the summer of 2019. All right, so if you remember back then, ERCOT had an 8.6% capacity reserve margin. That's really low. California, for example, runs at a 15% reserve margin. A lot of places do. Also in that summer, ERCOT reached a new record demand, 75 gigawatts, and they met that without having any rolling blackouts. And a lot of this is due to these voluntary reductions in demand. Now, I'm also going to point out energy prices don't necessarily coincide with 4CP. The 4CP can kind of distort energy prices. So as an example, in 2016, prices were $25 to $40 per megawatt hour during those peak load days because loads were backing down. Now in 2019, these red arrows are showing when prices were over $1,000 per megawatt hour, where energy prices are coinciding with these 4CP or these near CP events. And it's indicating, they're getting closer to scarcity conditions in 2019 than they were in 2018 because they had a very low reserve margin in 2019. So one of the things that you might be asking is, what about high energy prices? All those gritty customers, for example, aren't folks reducing demand due to high energy prices also? So ERCOT tries to disaggregate that as well. And that data is shown here, which I realize is a little bit hard to read, but essentially there's 7.7 million accounts in retail choice areas. And they've got about 100,000 customers that are on pricing that's indexed to wholesale market prices. And then they've got about 500, 600,000 customers that are on some kind of time varying rate. So like a time of use, or you've probably heard of the Texas free nights and weekends kinds of plans. Now what this chart is showing is they've broken down, depending on what kinds of rates or 4CP tariffs different customers are exposed to, and then looked at responses for the different peak days. And so the two columns on the left that say 4CP are basically showing the voluntary demand reductions that they attribute to 4CP for the CNI customers on the left and the munis and the co-ops on the right. And then the next few columns over are showing those customers that are exposed to high energy prices through indexing to day ahead or real-time prices. The point here is to note that ERCOT can get about 3 gigawatts of response with pricing. This helps them manage reserve margin levels that other parts of the country would never dream of doing. And then, so that was 2020 that I just showed. If I go back to that difficult summer of 2019, when I told you reserve margins were 8.6%, they had 4CP kicking in, they had high energy prices kicking in, and there were also a couple days when physical capability got really short and their emergency alert level 1 kicked in and they deployed emergency response services. So here, these loads are loads that are dispatched by ERCOT. So these are not voluntary DR, but rather loads that are paid to back down during an emergency condition. And that showed up on, you can see here, August 13th and August 15th. Those emergency alerts kicked in, and you can see in this kind of black line, the dip at about 3:30, where some of that is that emergency response service is kicking in. I'll note that on the bottom right, this is showing some of the energy price spikes on those same days. And you can see that on the actual peak day of the week, on August 12th, they actually had higher wind production. So prices didn't peak out at 9,000 like they did on the 13th. And so they didn't have to deploy their emergency alert conditions either. On the 13th, they had both the very high prices and to deploy their emergency response service. The point here is not that others should replicate exactly what Texas does, right? There are some drawbacks to this, and we can talk about that. The point here is that pricing can induce very strong voluntary incentives to reduce peak demand. This could lower system costs. This could lower costs for customers, and that pricing needs to be a tool in our toolbox, just like storage or any other resource is. Basically, we got the rate design people, we got the grid integration people, and we need to get together and we need to talk more and we need to work together more. With that, I am now going to introduce our speakers. We've got Ahmad Faruqui of the Brattle group, who's going to be talking about the changing landscape of rate design. Charles Miessner of Arizona Public Service, talking about modernizing. Oops, I just lost. Okay, are you going to the first presentation? I'll want to just introduce Ahmad first. Ahmad Faruqui has worked for more than 150 clients on 5 continents on the entire gamut of customer side issues, including rate design, demand response, energy efficiency, distributed energy resources, and electric transportation. Ahmad has worked for decades on rate design and what we need to do on the demand side way before it was cool. So we're really pleased to have him here with us. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Ahmad.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I appreciate the introduction. As you mentioned, I've been around the block a long time, and that's why I'm calling this the changing landscape of rate design. Finally, after decades of waiting, things are beginning to change. And so the big question is, why are they changing? Well, first of all, let me describe what they look like. We had flat volumetric rates with low fixed charges going back a century pretty much. Along the way, inclining or declining block rates were introduced, again, with low fixed charges. And in some cases, they had seasonal rates, again, with low fixed charges. So by and large, the story was volumetric. Take all of your costs incurred in generating, transmitting, and delivering electricity and providing customer service and meters and all of those things, and just keep it simple, put it into a volumetric rate that really doesn't reflect the cost structure of the industry, but it keeps it simple. And for years and years, we didn't have the meters to do anything much more sophisticated. So a combination of reasons, a desire for simplicity and the inability to convey anything more granular, resulted in us offering these prices, very simple volumetric rates. And now, of course, what we have is yesterday's customer is today's prosumer and tomorrow's prosumaker. Prosumaker is a prosumer with storage. It's not my coinage, somebody else created the term. I don't like it, but it's being used widely. It's in books now as well. So prosumaker is the customer of the future. There's solar on the roof. There are time of use rates. There are electric cars. There is battery storage, and there are smart thermostats. That's just one quick glimpse of why the rates need to change, because the cost structure has to be reflected in rates, or we will create a lot of unintended consequences. We'll have subsidies between customers without their knowing it. And as you probably know, in California, the subsidies have been quantified to be in the billions of dollars. So what are the tariffs of tomorrow? Well, they're beginning to take shape before our eyes. Time of use rates with significant price differentials and shorter peak periods. SMUD has rolled them out, and I'll say more about those shortly. 3-part rates with demand charges. Of course, we have Arizona Public Service on the program, so we'll get a good perspective from them. But other utilities are also going down that pathway, such as Ameren in Missouri and Georgia Power. Then you have dynamic pricing rates with higher fixed charges, and I will talk more about those as well. And real-time pricing rates with day-ahead and hour-ahead frequency. In Georgia, Georgia Power deploys them to its C&I customers, and I will comment more on those. And as we look at the future, we are finally beginning to see a scenario come to pass, which when I worked at EPRI, and my boss and mentor, Clark Gellings, used to say, we have to get prices to devices so it becomes hassle-free for the customer. Only then can we do real-time pricing. Well, that day is almost at hand. This is just for your reference. It just enumerates the rates I just mentioned, ranging from time of use to more dynamic rates. And the new wrinkle here is item number 8, which is the concept of a subscription plan or a fixed bill, which has been around for some time, but it would be combined with incentives to lower your energy use during certain critical times. And if you were to do that, you'll be rewarded with a rebate that will further lower the fixed bill. So these are kind of bookends. And what I will try to bring out in this conversation today is that all customers are not identical in their tastes, their lifestyles, or their preferences. Some want simplicity. Others are more than willing to have a time-varying rate in real time so that they can save money. And we can no longer just offer a single flat volumetric rate to all customers and expect that that rate, which has been around for 100 years, will promote economic efficiency and equity in this new world that we are living in. These rates, some of them have already been deployed, and this slide, again, is for your reference. It's listing where these rates are available today, and the slide, by the way, changes almost on a monthly basis. So this is a snapshot in time. It's sort of a global picture. And one of the really interesting things that I want to point out here is that sometimes we tend to assume that America is always the leader in all of these innovations. That is often not true. Look at Spain, for example, towards the bottom of that table. They have real-time pricing to residential customers as their default tariff, and 40% of their customers are on that tariff. So the Nordic countries also have a lot of real-time pricing activity for all classes of customers. So innovation is happening, and we did recently a survey, a global survey of 40 countries, and I hope to share that information during some other webinar and possibly write an article on it. But there's a lot of innovation happening on every continent on the planet: Latin America, Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas, along with Australia and New Zealand. They're all reinventing their tariff regimes. One question that won't go away and is always being asked is, will consumers respond to a time of use rate or a dynamic pricing rate or a real-time pricing rate? And the perception is that the demand for electricity is inelastic, that customers just have to use a certain amount regardless of how much it costs. Well, that has been shown to be incorrect over and over again. And in our database, which we're calling Arcturus because it's like an arc, we have plotted on the horizontal axis the peak to off-peak price ratio offered by these different rates by different utilities in different jurisdictions. And on the vertical axis, we have plotted the reduction in peak. Of course, there's a scatter plot because there are a lot of factors here, but the data is rich enough to allow regression analysis to be carried out. And when we carried out that analysis, we find that there is definitely more of an impact on peak, the higher is the peak to off-peak price ratio. The lower line or curve or arc is when you just have price, and the lighter colored arc above that is when you enable price with technologies like a smart thermostat. So you bring in technology, you boost responsiveness. You also make the customer's life easier. They don't have to remember when to do things. It's automated. According to the AIA, based on the data is from their survey 861 that many of you are familiar with, in the year 2019, 338 US utilities offered at least one form of time varying rate to residential customers. Altogether, 6.8 million customers, or 5% of all residential customers, are enrolled on one of these time varying rates. Now we have something like 138 million customers in the US, so that's still a very small number, but it is much higher than it was just a decade ago. And my expectation is that in another 5 years, that 5% would potentially rise to 20 or 25%. The largest time varying pricing deployments are shown here. And you will certainly recognize Baltimore Gas and Electric, which has a peak time rebate program as the default. And so 88% of their customers are actively participating in that. You have APS, and we'll hear from Chuck what is going on there. And then you have several other utilities listed as well. And by the way, the headcount of customers alone is not an indicator of how innovative the rates are. We will hear from Steve from Holy Cross, and you will hear how much innovation is taking place in a cooperative in the Rocky Mountains that has 50,000 customers. But the amount of intelligence and intellect they have applied to it exceeds that of some utilities with 5 million customers. So the long and short of it is, we need to have choices being offered to customers, and utilities are already beginning to do that. So in this graph, what I've done is I've plotted out the risk or bill volatility that comes with each of these rates. And no surprise, particularly for those who were following what happened in Texas on Valentine's Day and the day after Valentine's Day, real-time pricing unhedged and capped at $9 per kWh can create massive risks. On the other hand, it also comes with opportunities. The price is low most of the time. So for those customers who are willing to take the risk, the opportunity is huge. So you can put all of your stock if you want, or all of your 401k portfolio, and a single stock like Tesla or Google or Facebook, and I'm not recommending any of those stocks, by the way, and you could see tremendous growth or you could see a sudden fall. So that's RTP, unhedged, pure and simple. Certainly not appropriate for residential customers by any stretch of the imagination. But people still take it and nobody can stop them. And then at the other end of the spectrum is the guaranteed bill. Old-fashioned, just locks it in, doesn't matter how much you consume. It's like going to a buffet where it's all you can eat. But it's a bit more sophisticated than that, because your price and my price might vary based on our prior history. So if some customer uses a lot, their guaranteed bill is going to be a higher number than another one who doesn't. It's based on history with some risk added in. And then you have the other items on that chart. So what are some of the best-in-class tariffs that I want to just briefly talk about today? Certainly the one that stands out in my mind for commercial and industrial customers is Georgia Power's real-time pricing rate. This has been around for several decades now. It's really incredible. They have more than 2,000 customers on that rate. It's a two-stage rate. The first stage is your baseline load shape as a customer. And for that baseline load shape, you are going to be billed on the existing tariff, which is a three-part tariff with demand charges, energy charges, and fixed charges. So unless you change your baseline load shape, your bill is what it would have been otherwise. And the utilities revenues are the same as well. So it's protecting both sides of the transaction. But if you change your load shape, you will be then billed on hourly prices. And the hourly prices will be high or low, depending on whether it's the peak period that you're going to increase your usage or the off-peak period where you're going to increase your usage. You face different prices Some prior studies that I have seen seem to indicate that when the price went above $1 a kilowatt hour, for the group of customers, the peak demand went down by 17%. So a very effective rate, and in some ways similar to what you heard from Debbie with the 4CP concept, but different, but similar in terms of having very meaningful impacts. Now, if you are a customer above 1 megawatt of load, the prices are given to you on an hour ahead basis. If you're less than 1 megawatt, they are given to you on a day ahead basis. So it's trying to capture the sophistication that larger customers probably have in managing their processes. The second rate I want to mention is OG&E's residential variable peak pricing rate, which is called Smart Hours. And the Smart Hours rate serves 20% of residential customers. Customers set the thermostat based on their comfort level and savings target. Price signals are transmitted to the thermostat. Collectively, customers lower their peak demand by 40% and their bills by 20%. It is a very popular rate. I've been to Oklahoma City a few times, and what I have noticed is even the Uber drivers or the taxi drivers or the person sitting next to me on the plane is aware of this rate. So not only is it well designed, it is also incredibly well marketed. Customer engagement is the key to selling them on some of these more complex rates. Customers know what risk they're taking. They also know what the opportunity is. And then there is SMUD, which has a residential time of use pricing rate as the default offering, introduced a year or two ago. Nearly 98% of their customers are on that rate. Only 2% have opted out. And so much for those who say that residential customers cannot cope with time of use rates. Well, SMUD proves that even in a hot climate like Sacramento's, and I lived in Davis for 5 years, so know it can be very hot and demanding. People are happily on that rate. The peak to off-peak ratio is significant. It is 2.4 to 1. So there are opportunities to save. What are we likely to see in the next few years? So Ameren, Missouri, and Georgia Power are rolling out several different time of use rates, some with 3 periods, some with 2 periods, some with bigger differential peak to off-peak, some with a smaller differential. They are also offering a 3-part rate to residential customers with a demand charge, in other words. In California, the IOUs are rolling out mildly time differentiated TOU rates to all residential customers on a default basis. It'll take a couple of years before that rollout is completed. Now, besides rolling out these mildly differentiated TOU rates, they also have significantly differentiated opt-in TOU rates. I am on one such rate. It's a 3-period rate, and it is pretty significantly differentiated. So you can choose that, like if you have an electric car. If you have solar, it's mandatory for you. So those are some of the nuances. In Colorado and in Michigan, we are expecting to see a rollout of time of use rates as the default rate with significant differentials between peak and off-peak prices. As the notion of getting prices to devices becomes real, dynamic pricing rates will begin to be offered to residential customers throughout the nation. And the honest answer is we cannot, in a renewable generation mix future, which Debbie talked about, we cannot have flat rates, because if generation is variable because it is renewable, then load has to be variable as well, or you need to have a lot of battery storage. And we'll probably have both, but we cannot have flat rates in a world in the future which is heavily renewable focused. By 2035, by 2040, the generation mix might be upwards of 90% renewable and carbon free. So how do we deal with those oscillations? We have to bring in load flexibility induced by these pricing designs. It won't be easy. It'll be a heavy lift, because based on all of the cases that I have participated in myself or observed from a distance, there are 5 what I'm calling immortal objections that will always be raised. Objection 1, while time-varying rates might reduce peak load, they will not lower customer bills. It is not true, but that doesn't mean it will not be raised. Objection number 2, they will lower peak demand, but will not lower transmission and distribution costs since they do not depend on load. If you can lower peak demand and lower generation costs, that itself is pretty significant. And in some parts of the country, like in Maryland, like in New York, and also in Australia and New Zealand, and possibly in other jurisdictions, studies indicate that transmission and distribution costs do vary with load. They do vary by time of day. And so those rates, time varying rates, can also reduce those costs, not just generation costs. Objection 3, ongoing pilots show minimal customer reaction to price signals in changing their load profile. So that basically is an objection raised by those who either don't know how to study the reports coming out from pilots, or who think the pilots are gimmicks in which there were no real customers, but robots. Objection number 4, customers have little time or interest in becoming a home energy manager. They just want the lights to come on when they flip the bill and get an affordable bill at the end of the month. Yes, that's true. Many customers are like that, and therefore we need to give choices to customers, but not every customer is like this. So we don't need 100% of the customers responding to these rates. We just need 1/3 to 50% of the customers responding, and the system will become much more affordable for 100% of the customers. And then there is the last one, is the chestnut. Time-varying tariffs will harm low-income customers, senior citizens, and people with medical disabilities. Well, that was put to the test most recently in the Maryland pilots that 3 utilities carried out. This issue was a very important issue, and there were 2 tracks that each utility had, one for low and moderate income customers and one for non-LMI customers, and the results were encouraging in both tracks. So the argument that they will not work for low and moderate income customers has yet again been shown to be false. So how do we get to the future? How do we address these objections? Because there are real objections. They will arise in just about every case. First of all, look at the different rate options. Pick the ones that you think are best suited for your jurisdiction. Compute what the impact will be on different customers of those different rate designs. You have the data, the load research data. Try to understand which customers are likely to see an adverse bill impact. And then, of course, allow for some price elasticity to come in. There will be price response. That's what all the data from nearly 400 pilots has shown. And then try to come up with remedies to address the adverse bill impacts. There could be bill protection. There could be more education to customers. There could be all kinds of mechanisms, like providing them more efficient technologies like smart thermostats. Combining your EE and DR programs with rate design, I think that's the way to go. And then conduct focus groups with customers. Run a pilot to measure the response. Even though there are almost 400 pilots out there, every jurisdiction wants to do its own pilot, because somehow the air and the food and the greenery is different. And so they're entitled to run their pilots, and they should certainly run them. I've even seen pilots being done 10 times by the same utility and still not actually implemented. So, as somebody who analyzes the data from pilots, I honestly don't have an issue with that. It's good business for several of us, but sometimes you have to really think hard. Do I really need a pilot? So weigh the pros and cons. If you have not done a pilot, if your climate is different or your customer mix is different, you definitely should do a pilot. If you're introducing a new rate that has never been implemented, like a subscription plan with incentives, do a pilot. If you have never done real-time pricing and you want to do it, do a pilot. Then determine the rollout strategy. And finally, track the deployment of the rate design and make modifications as needed. So before I close, I want to touch on what happened to Griddy. And as everyone knows, Griddy was a very adventurous company with adventurous customers who offered real-time pricing. And unfortunately, when prices hit the $9 per kWh cap, disaster ensued, which everybody would have known would have ensued, but apparently some didn't. And so some people are saying, oh, Gritty, basically it has written the obituary of dynamic pricing. So I take some inspiration from this quote from W.C. Fields: "The news of my death is greatly exaggerated." So around 1% of the customers in ERCOT were on these prices. They probably never thought the price would hit that level. And of course, disaster ensued. Dynamic pricing, by the way, is something I totally support. There's a reason for it. There is analysis for it. And there's basically a rationale that many consumers accept. But I will say it is not a panacea. Just think about an airline. So airlines use dynamic pricing to balance demand and supply. If the flight is oversold, they offer vouchers to customers who are willing to take a later flight. And I'm sure all of us have been on a plane where those vouchers were offered. I have never taken them. I've been on a business trip. I could never afford to take another flight, but there's always someone who will take it, and then they keep raising the price. At some point, demand and supply are in balance and the plane takes off. These vouchers are nothing else but peak time rebates. However, if the plane has a mechanical problem, and I'm sure all of us have had that happen to us at least once, I've had it happen to me dozens of times. If the plane has a mechanical problem, it won't fly. Doesn't matter how much you're willing to pay. A customer on the plane could say, I'll give you $100,000. I really want to get to my destination. They'll say, well, get off this plane and try to find another plane. So certain problems on the supply side cannot be remedied by dynamic pricing. And so what happened in ERCOT really, in my view, could not have been addressed. It was such a massive shutdown of the supply system because of the weather conditions that there is no amount of dynamic pricing that could have solved it. So in closing, I'm going to bring out another quote here from Arthur C. Clarke, this time the futurist. You can always expect a radical new idea to generate three reactions. It is completely impossible is the first answer. I have heard that for 40 years. It's possible, but not worth doing. I've heard that for 20 years. I said it was a good idea all along. Believe me, I'm hearing that today more than I've ever heard it before. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. That was a wonderful talk. And I see questions rolling in on Slido, and I encourage you, if you do have questions, to go to slido.com, use ESIG 4 as the event code, and ask and vote your questions. We're not going to answer questions in between talks because I can see that some of these questions are going to pertain to more than one speaker. With that, I'd like to turn it over next to Chuck Miessner. We're really happy to have Chuck from a consultant to Arizona Public Service talk to us about modernizing residential electric rates. Chuck's got over 30 years experience in the utility industry and pricing and resource planning and regulatory policy. He is the chairman of the Edison Electric Institute National Rates and Regulatory Committee, and he's appeared before regulators and legislators on energy issues in Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Wisconsin. With that, I turn it over to you, Chuck. Chuck, we can't hear you.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. I'm going to talk a little bit about there's two things going on in pricing these days, as Ahmad was talking about. One is kind of the dynamic type pricing, curtailable programs, peak time rebates, those sorts of things, the dispatchable pricing. Then there's the other piece of just the bread and butter utility tariffs, the day in and day out rate schedules that customers are on. And I'm going to focus on what we've done with those over the last 3 years in Arizona. A little bit about APS first. We're an investor-owned utility in Arizona, 1.1 million residential customers. We've got about 58% of our customers, this is residential customers, on either a time use energy rate, I call it TOUE, or a time use rate with a demand charge, I call that TOUD in my presentation. About 58%, so it's a really big program. And we've also have about 120,000 customers out of 1.1 million with rooftop solar, so a pretty big solar presence in our state as well. And we are fully deployed with AMI metering. So Debbie talked a little bit about this in her opening comments. You know, we all talk about smart homes, you know, with smart end uses and appliances that are integrated with the distribution grid. And it's kind of a vision of a lot of folks these days of how things are going to go in the future in terms of appliances that respond to grid conditions and actually provide capacity and energy to the grid, maybe even ancillary services at some point. And at APS, you know, we've realized that you really need smart rates to incent a smart house. A smart house is really useless unless you have the right price signals to incent the usage at the right times. So what is a smart rate? A smart rate seeks, in my opinion, seeks to match lifestyle, bill savings, and resource cost savings. It also aligns the price signal with resource costs and needs. So what have we done at APS? This is mainly implemented in 2017, August of 17. So we've had it for a couple of years now. Number one, we reformed net metering. Number two, we eliminated our inclining block rates. These were, as Ahmad said, you know, you talk about smart appliances and you look around, for most utilities in the country that I see, they've got the same rate designs that they had in the 1950s. And this, and most have inclining block rates. If you're not familiar, inclining block rate means that you might have, let's say, you might have for the first 500 kilowatt hours that you use, you might have a rate, let's say your average price is 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, you might have a price of 7 cents a kilowatt hour for the first 500 kilowatt hours you use. And maybe the next 1,000 you use, it costs 10 cents a kilowatt hour, your average cost. And then anything above that 1,500 usage, it might cost, you know, 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's an inclining block rate. And what it really means is the big homes are paying above cost and the little homes are paying below cost. They're getting subsidized. And these were put in place way back when. Certainly they were popular in the 1970s after PURPA to help stimulate energy efficiency. But they wreak havoc with what we're trying to do today with demand response and other attributes in trying to be a real resource for a utility or for a grid. And this is the big problem. And I'll talk a little bit about the problem of eliminating inclining block rates and why it's so hard to do. But that's what we did at APS. And we continue to focus on time of use and on demand rates. We'd had a pretty big program prior to 3 years ago. We've had actually residential demand rates for about 30 years, which is very unusual for utility on the residential sector. We shortened our on-peak hours to provide a better resource. And we also, Debbie showed the duck curve, you know, which is a kind of a winter daytime phenomena where you've got a real lull in usage and then a huge ramp up in the early evening hours. And both are problems. Both the belly of the duck is a problem and the ramp up is a problem. So we shortened our on-peak. We actually added a winter super off-peak period to address the duck curve. Let's talk about the first one, our net metering reform. We replaced our net metering program with a solar purchase rate, but we did it. It's still a subsidized program. We started out with a pretty sizable above cost purchase rate. And in 2017, the bars you see here are from 2017 to 2026, and it shows the cents per kilowatt hour of the solar purchase rate. And so you can see as we progress down from 2017, we're just a couple of years into it here now. But eventually in 2026, we'll be down to about where we should be at an avoided cost rate of about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But we started with a subsidized rate so that we wouldn't just completely decimate the solar industry that was thriving in Arizona. The other thing I want to mention on this is what happens is customers, let's say customers this year, the prices of last year, 10,000, current price is 10.45 cents a kilowatt hour for your purchase for anything that flows back to the grid. You actually lock into that for 10 years. So these are vintaged rates. And we also grandfathered the existing customers on net metering in the old rates for 20 years. And you can see here is the installation from 2011 to 2020, but you can see from 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, this is the amount of newly installed systems, residential rooftop systems measured by megawatts DC for those years. And you can see in the light blue, it's under the net metering regime, and in the purple, it's under this purchase rate regime. The point on this slide is that we've maintained a pretty healthy solar market, really about what we had before, measuring 2018 versus 2016, 2020 are all the same amount of megawatts DCs installed. So we've had still a subsidized program, but at least it has a glide path to manage down into an avoided cost rate where it should be. Now let's look at the second piece, which is the rate design piece. What I'm showing here is our current participation. This is December of 2020 by our major rate types for residential customers. On the top two this is our preferred rates in terms of a resource. The first one is our time of use demand rate. This is a three-part rate. It's got a demand charge that's only only effective on peak, so weekends and night times, holidays, you don't have to worry about demand, only during the on-peak periods. And our on-peak hours are 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. So it's really 5 hours a day. It does hit right into, it hits right into the dinner hour and all that. So customers have to manage to it. But it provides a lot of customers some pretty good savings on their bill. Our time use energy rate is a typical energy rate. We've got about a 2.4 to 1 on-peak to off-peak price ratio for the energy charge, and the same hours of 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. weekdays. And you can see there we've got about 354,000 customers on that rate out of 1.1 million, and 317,000 on the demand rate. So about a third of our customers are on a demand rate. Now we get into the light blue rates. These are the old two-part rates. This is kind of what we did with the inclining block rate, or how we got rid of it. We actually separated into three rates. And one of the first things I wanted to do when I embarked on this was the second to the bottom bar. I want you to focus on that for just a second. Flat, extra small. So this is just a two-part rate. It's got a service charge and a flat kilowatt hour charge. And these are for our extra small customers, but it's a lot of customers. So these are everybody that uses on average 600 kilowatt hours or less. Our average usage is about 1,000 kilowatt hours, and our median usage is a little lower than that. So there's quite a few customers. But as Ahmad said in one of his objections, you're going to hurt the low-income customer. You're going to hurt the senior citizens living in an apartment if you go to time use rates and demand rates. And so we just took that off the table. I don't think this is the long-term solution, but to get started, we just took all of that argument off the table and said, you know what, we're going to take those customers and keep them on a flat rate. Another thing that did was the problem with getting rid of inclining block rates is those smaller customers that are using 0 to 500 and paying way less than your cost. If you put them on an average flat rate, they might have a 20 to 30% bill impact just from switching the rates. And so what you're doing, that's just dead on arrival. If you're taking your small apartment, customers, low income and senior citizen customers, and you're giving them a 20 to 30% price impact, and you're arguing, well, they were subsidized all these years, they were paying below cost. That argument just doesn't make it. You're dead on arrival. So this is how we handle it. We'll probably work on time use rates for them in the future, but for now, they're on a flat rate. Then we took our other flat customers, our inclining block customers, the large ones. That's that first 24,455 customers, and then the medium ones, 100,000. That's what we have on them today, but we had over 500,000 customers on this inclining block rate when we started. So our objective was to get all of our largest customers, and these are folks using more than our average, more than 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, to get all of them voluntarily on a time use energy or time use demand rate, and most of them are. It's a big advantage. Most of these customers can save, even if they really don't shift load off peak or manage their demand. Most of them can save by moving over to the rate. So that's been a success. And then the flat medium customers, many can save on an energy, time use energy or demand rate, but they have to work at it a little bit. So those are still kind of sitting there. And you can see down below, we have 120,000 plus residential solar customers, but at this time, 3 years ago, we had 75,000 that were grandfathered onto their old rates. Now let's move on to what we did with the time of use rate. We made some pretty big changes. We basically shortened up our time of use hours. Here is a depiction of what we call a heat map. This is capacity and energy costs. You could do this also with your system load or your system net load, but it's basically green kind of means low areas and red means high areas. And so you can kind of see under the red area where I have peak load, those are our new on-peak hours, 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. You can see this is January through December are all the rows going down. So obviously in Phoenix, we're worried about the summer. It's newsflash, it's hot here in the summer. We have most summer days are above 100 degrees, and some of them get up to above 120 degrees here. And so June, July, August, and even into September, it's hot here. And so that's really what we're trying to manage from a resource perspective, is to lower those times. And you can see how the 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. window helps us there. You can also see the duck curve in the January, February, March, April, the solid green, meaning kind of low cost time period. We actually have negative wholesale cost in many of these hours. So actually by reducing load and increasing load, we can actually buy energy and make money. And so that's the duck curve there that we've added as well in our time of use rates. Here's the hours again. The black is the hours we used to have. We used to have a 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. peak, a real long one. Then we moved to noon to 7 some years ago. Our peak is getting later due to the solar, and our net load is definitely getting lower, but even our system peak is getting a bit later. So the red is our new 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. 5-hour peak. Let's look at the demand rate here. It's got a $13 a month service charge. Demand charges are pretty healthy here. $17 a kW month in the summer, $12 a kW month in the winter. Those are pretty big for residential demand charges. And obviously lower energy charges as well. You can see on the chart, on the pie chart, about 45% of our billed amounts come from the demand charge on this rate. As I mentioned before I leave this, I mentioned that the demand is only on peak, so it's only during 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. Weekends, night times, mornings, and holidays are all, demand is not affected during those times, so that helps. The other thing that really helps is if you look in the fine print bullet number 1, comment number 1, demand is based on the highest 1-hour peak. I really recommend this, for most business, demand rates have been around for business customers for a long time, and we use 15-minute integrated demand for business customers. Across the country, it's usually 15-minute or 30-minute for business customers. And if you go over to demand, I recommend not using that. Make something, we use a 1-hour integrated demand for residential, and it really helps. Someone turns on a hair dryer these days can draw 2 kW from the grid. You don't want to have someone use a hair dryer for 15 minutes and add $34 to their bill just for doing that. So a 1-hour integrated demand. We also have a load factor based demand limiter as well for people that make sure they don't make sure they don't kind of bust the budget by just making a mistake in 1 month. Here's the time use energy rate here. We have about, as I mentioned before, about a little over a 2-to-1 on peak to off peak price ratio, both winter and summer, and a $13 service charge as well. We get about 60% of our energy, of our bills, is based on the off peak energy charge. What's the impact? I've got 2 slides I'm going to end up with here on impact. Everybody's concerned, well, you have these, so what is it really being a resource? Here's kind of an anecdotal look. This is 5-minute intervals on a peak summer day recently. This wasn't the California heat storm, but a peak summer day recently. And you're looking at system load in megawatts here for 5-minute intervals in the day, starting from obviously 1 in the morning till midnight. And I've bracketed in red our 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. hours. You can see just anecdotally the kind of drop off and the drop off in load and the pickup in load right at our 3 to 8 p.m. Boundaries there. That's an anecdotal look at it. One of the things I'll give you is then you can do more. Studies with these as well, econometric studies with these load studies. And we did an interesting thing a couple of years ago, probably like 3 or 4 years ago now, that I think is very interesting. We published this in a EPRI report. We actually were looking at time use energy versus time use demand. And was there a advantage of demand and energy reduction from going to just an energy rate to a time use demand rate? And so we had pretty big programs in both of these. And so we actually looked at people who, over a 3-year period, people who switched from a time use energy rate and a time use demand rate. This is a great data set because we had a year's worth of data on time use energy before the customer switched. And then we had at least a year's worth of data that we looked at, after they switched. So you have the same home. You don't have all these problems of comparing my house with your house on different rates. We actually had a full year before and after on the rate, basically a panel study for this. And we compared the same home, and we also these were all in the same area. This is all in the Phoenix metro area. Obviously, we have mountainous areas with snow and everything in Arizona that people really don't know, but this is all in the hot, low desert Phoenix area. And we also weather normalized the data as well. This is about 977 customers on this. And here's the, wait for it, results. Pretty busy slide. Let me tell you what you're looking at. So we looked at on column 2, the total kilowatt hour reduction, switching from a time use energy rate to a time use demand rate. We looked at and we did this seasonally, but this is in the summer. We looked at the total summer kilowatt hours. Next column over, we looked at the on-peak kilowatt hour reduction in the summer, the on-peak KW reduction, and then the bill reduction. Again, this isn't going from a flat rate to a time use rate or demand rate. This is going from what you already had on a time use energy rate, the reductions you already had there. This is the incremental reduction you got from going to a time use demand rate. And we sorted this by the different rows are the biggest savers to the biggest losers, if you will. None of our customers are losers, but in this trial we had some losers. So the top row, for example, were the top 10% of customer savers. So that group saved, and that's in the orange there. They saved 23%. They reduced their summer monthly kilowatt hour energy consumption by 23% compared to a time use energy rate. They compared their on-peak summer kilowatt hour consumption by 32% compared to a time use energy rate. And they reduced their on-peak demand by 31% compared to a time use energy rate. And they reduced their bill by 30%. So those are our gold medal winners. And you can see as we go down, there's the next 20%, the next 10%, the next 10%, next 10%, until you get down to the blue. That's the 60 percentile mark. they had 0% incremental reduction in total kilowatt hours, 3% incremental reduction in kilowatt hour and on-peak kilowatt hours, and 2% incremental reduction in KW and a 10% incremental in bill. So that's kind of like from the blue line to the orange lines. Those are kind of our, those are kind of our winners, or people that we'd like to be. Not everybody's going to be in that top line, but I like to see if you can kind of get everybody from the blue line to like maybe 2 rows up, where I bracketed it in the black there. That's kind of like the middle third. That's your bread and butter. If you can get, as Ahmad said, you're not going to get everybody, but you can get a third of the customers kind of right in that zone where they're reducing their bill by 10%, reducing demand by 2 to 8%. That's a really good outcome. On the bottom end, going down to the green, we had our bottom 10% savers who didn't save at all. They actually paid 10% more on their bill, and actually increased their on-peak KW by 25%, even though they're on a demand rate. So you're going to get some of those, you have to work with them, maybe get them off the program or work with them, but you are going to get some of those customers. So anyway, that's some, I think, kind of interesting results on a demand rate, but we obviously love time use energy rates and demand rates and recommend both of those for folks. And with that, we're going to take questions later, so I will turn it back to Debbie.
Thanks so much, Chuck. That was a great look into deep dive into Arizona. Next, we're going to take a deep dive into Colorado with my old friend Steve Beuning, who's Vice President of Power Supply and Programs at Holy Cross Energy. Holy Cross Energy is developing both supply side and demand side resources as it seeks to attain 100% annual energy from renewables by 2030. And Steve, as you may know, used to be the past president of ESIG, and he has 37 years utility experience in bulk system operations, regional wholesale markets, and renewable integration. So I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Wow, Debbie, thank you for that nice introduction, and hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay, and look forward to giving you some comments and observations here today. Holy Cross is a distribution electric cooperative. We are a wholesale customer of XL Energy. We're located in Western Colorado. We have a winter peak demand of 270. We're strongly winter peaking. Our summer peak demand only runs around 165 megawatts. We own both transmission and distribution. We're a small company with 165 megawatts and $135 million in annual revenue. So Debbie pointed out to you all, we have a goal of 100% annual energy from renewables by 2030. This is an example of our load curve on an annual basis projected for the year 2024. And what you see on the blue lines below the x-axis there are projected hours during the year when we'll have renewable energy oversupply. And we'll get to that in a little bit here in the discussion. We are able to optimize our programs and offerings under the basis of, I'll characterize it roughly as contract cost arbitrage, as opposed to any type of avoided fundamental investment on our system. The aspects of our contract arbitrage are primarily around our capacity costs from our default renewable supply, our default wholesale supplier. We have contract flexibility that gives us the right to substitute against our default supplier, and that's a value stream for us. The other thing in terms of a value stream that we're looking at is what we can do to optimize our renewable oversupply. I found it interesting to hear what Chuck just said for APS's experience. And then in the future too, we want our programs and demand response flexibility to be able to address self-provision of not only these capacity attributes and load flexibility, but use that load flexibility as an option for self-providing the ancillary service obligations that would be required from a transmission tariff balancing area provider if that becomes necessary. So we have two kind of philosophical approaches. In one program approach, we allow our members the option to decide on participation through a response to voluntary price signals, no penalties for failure to respond. In the other design, we give higher incentives, but we also have an option to control the demand response in that case. To help facilitate our members' interactions, we have a tariff, excuse me, that allows us to overcome investment hurdles. We can fund installation costs, for example, on electric vehicle chargers or battery energy storage devices, and allow the member to repay that through their utility rates over time. And, you know, the philosophy that we bring to this, I don't know if these are philosophy statements or just observations, but we're just looking for good value. We don't have a bias towards capital investment. We do have the luxury of a known avoided capacity cost from our wholesale supplier, and that makes it more helpful for us in designing the value of these programs. One of the things that's been key for us to get value in our demand response and demand flexibility, though, has been having accurate day-ahead forecasting of our own hourly load, our wholesale suppliers' hourly load, and then what the impacts of variable production from wind and solar resources will be. We look at this scheduling of our demand response just like we would schedule or commit a traditional generating resource, for example. We have customers that are really interested in participating. They have both local resilience issues. We're in a high dry climate here, subject to wildfire risks. We've had 2 major nearby wildfires in the last 3 years that have put our customers' electric supply in jeopardy. And local resilience is a strong interest in our membership. But also, shortly after I started at Holy Cross, our CEO was making a community speech and talked about a future that was that included a reliance on local supply resources. And he got an ovation from the audience that was a really remarkable observation to me. We don't have probably as many passive customers as the typical utility does. There's a lot of green and renewable interest in our communities. And just lastly, one of the things that I think we are expecting will have a strong influence on our demand response programs in the future is the implementation of FERC Order 2222 and the development of regional markets at the balancing area level and regional level that will create increased opportunities for deriving value from the demand response products and programs that we're rolling out. So philosophically, this kind of lays out our structures where we have control options. For example, we have a battery storage optimization program. It gives our members a resilience value. We always keep a certain amount of storage energy in the battery for the member to use to ride through any type of momentary outages on our system. We like to think they never have to reset their microwave oven clock again if they participate in this program. That's the goal anyway. But it also gives us very schedulable and controllable demand response capability. We also have a program where we have a control option. We give our members a free EV charger if they enroll in a program that allows us to modulate the rate of delivery to those charging assets. We've seen that our average member plugs in their EV for 11 hours and yet only needs a 2-hour window to fill up their tank. And by modulating that rate of charging to help address some of our energy oversupply and potentially in some cases our peak demand billing exposure, that's a benefit to the utility as well. Over on the member control side, we do have a time of day rate with a 4-to-1 on peak to off peak window. It's 7 days a week. There's no demand charge for members who participate in that. And what we've seen is some of our regional transit customers are really interested in this. It gives them the chance to recharge the transit fleet in the off-peak periods and avoid demand charges for transit charging that they otherwise would have been exposed to under the old rate structure. On the peak demand and oversupply reduction programs, it's a statistical population, and I'll show you some slides on that in more detail. So let me move ahead. The first of these two is the peak time payback program. It's driven in its its payment metrics by a statistical baseline of similar days recent to the peak period in terms of establishing a baseline for their members' consumption. We measure their performance during the event against that baseline, and for the avoided energy during a declared high event, we pay $500 a megawatt hour, and during a critical event, we pay our member $1,000 a megawatt hour for their avoided consumption against that baseline. We have over 3% of our members that are enrolled in this program now. The aggregate reduction against baseline on average runs about 25%. We've had a consistent response even during peak demand periods driven by heat. I got to admit, we don't have a strong air conditioning component in the mountain communities we serve. One of the things that's exciting about this program is the pessimists all said, everybody will quit participating after a few events because they'll get sick of it. And we actually have seen a much lower than expected erosion in participation. We declare on average about 4 peak time events per month, typically run a couple hours each. And that's all 12 months of the year because we're on a 12 CP capacity billing basis for our wholesale requirements. So we're really pleased with how this program has turned out, even though we're little. The other thing I wanted to show you is our Green Up program that we're piloting right now. We're forecasting to our members that we would declare about 300 hours a year. Remember those blue lines below the x-axis that you saw? During those forecasted intervals, we give them a deep discount on their volumetric electric consumption above a statistical baseline. So in other words, they have an incentive to consume during those periods. And we did our first pilot test of this program with one of our more active industrial members. The blue line that you see on this graph is their baseline consumption, prepared in a similar statistical method to the way we prepare the baseline for our peak time payback program. But what you can see here is they were able to shift load into that event, and that's exactly the type of response that we hope we can get from our aggregate population. So just to wrap things up here, I think this is my last slide. On our EV programs at this point, we have about a 1.25 megawatt of controllable residential load. I know that doesn't sound like much, but as best we can tell, we have 34% of the registered electric vehicles in our service territory participating in this program. So when you look at it on a market penetration basis, we're really pleased about that. We also recently launched a program called Power Plus in cooperation with Tesla and a local Tesla installer, where we will finance the installation of power walls at a member's residence. They get the resilience benefit of having that backup storage capability. We get the demand response control feature to help manage our peak. And again, on both of these programs, we have an offer where we will support installation costs over time. Also, we're just piloting a program for our voluntary demand response members on providing them the use of home energy monitoring devices so that they can evaluate more precisely what actions in their home help with providing the level of demand response that they want to achieve. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is if you have all of these devices and programs, you need to orchestrate the control of them. We're excited about our work that's underway with Camu Energy out of Palo Alto, which will be our control platform for integrating these programs and demand response into our operations. So we're well down the road on the development of that. Here's my contact info, and Debbie, I'll hand the microphone back to you and the panel for a response to the group.
Sure. Thank you so much, Steve. It's really amazing what you guys have been able to accomplish in such a short period of time. I mentioned before that we were going to talk about the Texas event, and I guess I'd like to, the speakers want to show their faces. I wanted to invite them to talk about the fact that we just had, issues with customers, gritty customers and others in Texas on real-time prices that, faced extremely high bills from unhedged real-time price exposure. And what are your thoughts about, what's that tension between trying to protect customers and yet trying to expose them to prices that reflect market and grid conditions? What are your thoughts about what we need to do differently?
I'll just have a very quick response. I think what Texas has taught us is that it's best not to have the price cap at such a high value that it's 90 times higher than at what otherwise the average price would have been, around 9 cents shooting up to $90. To $9 from 9 cents. I mean, that is like a leap that probably nobody ever thought would come to pass. So make them aware of it, put more caps and collars like Georgia Power does, or just have critical peak pricing, which obviously has a hedge built in, or do what OG&E does. I think it was just even the industrial and commercial customers that Georgia Power has, as I explained in my presentation, there's a lot of hedging built into it. It's a two-stage bill, and then you can buy, if you want, a cap or a collar or a floor. So it requires a bit more sophistication than what we saw. That's my point.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Can I jump in too? I just would say that some of that, as I'm not familiar with the Texas retail rate design. I don't expect anybody force the electric customers to take that rate option to be exposed to full market price. It clearly indicates that many electric customers don't understand hedging and risk or what their exposure was to that type of market. I've always thought having supply is the best hedge. And if you're in a position as an electric customer where you don't have supply, you need to understand the risks that you're taking in the rate that you enroll in. I just observed the governor of Colorado. I only heard this secondhand, so I don't know if I'm characterizing this accurately, but made a comment that electricity customers should have an option to opt out from price exposure due to price events like occurred in Texas. Obviously, that's outside his jurisdiction, but the philosophical concept here is why not have a cap and a collar on rate design and make that a selectable attribute for the electric customer?
Yeah, I'll make a couple comments. Yeah, I think sometimes we don't learn from history, even if it's pretty prominent history. You really shouldn't have any uncapped unhedged offerings like that, especially for residential customers, but probably for nobody. The early real-time pricing programs in the 80s and early 90s were like that. And all it took was one big event in the Midwest in MISO back then that gave some of these industrial customers, $1 million surprises on their electric bills back then, and probably got some people fired from these industrial companies, because rates weren't their core competency. And so, and energy wasn't something that wasn't part of their business strategy. So after that, all of the real-time pricing programs went to like what you see in Georgia Power, where it's a two-part program. Your 90%, 95% of what you're using is just the tariffed rate. It's hedged. It's only that 5% on the margin that's subject to real-time pricing, and they all moved to that. And then I flash forward to I was an energy broker in the California energy market when it imploded in the early 2000s, and the California Energy Commission basically made the utilities buy off the spark market for all of their native load, but yet they had set rates, and they put both PG&E and Edison into bankruptcy and created problems there that they paid for 20 years on electric bills.
Thanks. Those are good points. There's a lot to learn. I'm going to turn it over to Slido because we only have a few minutes left. And first question is, how far is U.S. tariff design moving towards spatial pricing? Cost differences reflecting geography as well as congestion. So I think here, moving to say nodal prices. And maybe I would even assert at some point we need to get to pricing on the distribution system as well. And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about how we get towards more granularity in pricing to affect load.
I'll make a quick comment here. I've definitely seen offerings, from a number of utilities, whether it's the like green energy pricing with a value back, a wholesale price value back based on nodal pricing and things like that. So I'm seeing some of it. The bread and butter utility rates, though, really aren't locational yet.
Yeah, that's my sentiment as well. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about distributional level, locational marginal cost pricing, but it's mostly the subject of IEEE articles and conference proceedings. In practicality, it's very tough. I've even had debates and discussions on why is it okay for two neighboring utilities to have different rates, but you cannot have variation in the rates within a utility, and it's all political.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add on to that, my agreement with Chuck and Ahmad, and just the question boils down to the allocation of risk between the utility and the customer. Most of the U.S. By energy volume already has location-based congestion pricing at the wholesale level, and the role of the incumbent utilities has typically been to moderate or modulate that risk on behalf of their retail customers. So I'll stop there.
Sure, thanks. So the next question is addressed to Ahmad, but I think, Chuck also talked about time-of-use rates, and Steve might want to weigh in. It's about the kind of rebound effect and the spikes that you get with time-of-use rate periods, right before the periods, the on-peak and off-peak periods start. Do you have suggestions about how to mitigate those rebounds?
So OG&E has a rebound. I asked them specifically about the rebound, and they said it happens in their off-peak period when they have lower cost, and so it's not an issue for them. It's a question of how you define the width of the peak period, and as long as you can cover possible rebound occurrences, I think you're in good shape. The other way to deal with it, much more complicated though, is to stagger the definition of the pricing periods by individual customers. That used to be done for direct load control, for example, of air conditioners, as some of you might remember.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. It's interesting. We just finished a rate hearing with this issue. We have a 3 to 8 on-peak period, and different people wanted to change that, and a number of people wanted to shorten it to 7 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. Well, we have temperatures that are above 100 degrees at midnight, in the summertime here and stuff. So our load at 8 p.m. and even 9 p.m. is pretty high. It's within 5% of our peak. So we really worry about if we had a on-peak period that ended at 7 and we had this rebound effect, we could create a new peak. Instead of at 6 p.m., we could be peaking at 7:01. So it's a concern for us.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to maybe skip to this next question about the tension between making rates easy and convenient versus beneficial for the grid. How do you manage that when you do your rate design?
I'll let the utility experts weigh in.
I'll just say quickly, it's a real, I mentioned already, we have a 1 hour integrated demand when probably for residential, when you probably should use 15 minutes from a resource perspective. We have an on-peak demand. We should really have probably 2 or 3 demand charges, one for distribution that's untimed and one for G&T that's timed. I think Colorado was actually, Public Service Colorado was actually looking at something like that, piloting that Excel up there. So we have blunt instruments. You can't be an economist and try to optimize everything. You'll just wow people into oblivion and just confuse them.
I second that question. I do say I've changed style of utility employment over the last several years. I formerly was at a large investor-owned where rate flexibility was a very difficult undertaking because of the time and effort required for Public Utility Commission interaction. And I'm not bragging now, but I have to say, as a distribution cooperative, our board is our regulator and our community is our audience, and things happen a lot faster here.
Great.
I'm jealous, Steve.
Okay, maybe we'll take just one last question. Yeah, real quick. Ahmad, there was a question about interaction between dynamic prices such as CPP or CP charges and capacity remuneration mechanisms, and can flexible loads benefit from both?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the airline analogy where you have dynamic pricing most of the time, balancing demand and supply, and then when there's a real capacity shortage, it's oversold. You bring in the peak time rebate. Is like a capacity remuneration mechanism. And so I believe both are needed, but one should really be used for backup emergencies rather than all the time. I mean, that's my preference, but politically, it has been very difficult in many jurisdictions to move towards dynamic pricing, and all of the signals point towards making the rebate strategy, the remuneration mechanism, the default. I've had my share of debates and with utility executives, and I've laid out the issues, and the answer is it's my company and not yours. You can write as many papers as you want, talk to as many conferences, but I have to deal with my customers. Ultimately, rate design is not just an art or a science, it's politics, particularly for the investor-owned segment. And so that's the challenge we have.
Yes, exactly. Thanks, Ahmad. So I think it's about time to wrap it up. And I'd like to thank our panelists for the great presentations, for the great discussion, and thank all of you on the phone for your participation. I think we've got some great insights into pricing options going forward. I hope there's some good stimulating thoughts for everyone to take over to the next workshop. And I just wanted to remind you that the spring workshop sessions are going to be held every Tuesday and Thursday through April 8th. There's no charge. You're all invited to attend. Just go to esig.energy to register. And thank you again for your participation and for the great speakers. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time.